I'm going to show you a great attacking game played in the US Junior Championship, which is currently taking place in St. Louis. So with the white pieces we have John Burke, who's rated 2562, and with the black pieces Awonder Liang, rated 2592. So Awonder Liang, 16 years old, bit of a star. He's attempting to win the US Juniors for the third time in succession. So that's a pretty good record in itself. And, well, he has already played in the US Championship proper. So, you know, he's gaining a lot of experience. And, yeah, we expect great things from him in the future. Now, he's playing a Caro-Kann and plays this sideline with knight f6, not bishop f5. Already, yeah, well, not unusual, but, yeah, definitely a sideline. And now g takes f6. Well, at the highest levels, this is rather frowned upon these days, although it's not so bad. But e takes f6 is more unusual, although it has a few adherents at the top level. Played now and again. It's a strategically unusual position because it looks daft to kind of cripple the pawn structure on the king side, giving white this nice 4-3 majority. But actually, strategically, it's quite rich, and there are some unusual features with this clump of pawns on the king side that make it, well, certainly playable for black. And I must confess that I was drawn to this game because I used to play this with black, actually. And it's interesting. Now, white plays in the approved way here. Just lining up the queen and bishop against this pawn. And this has always been thought to be quite dangerous for black, actually, because black struggles to find a good way to protect this pawn. I know it seems funny when you've got 4 pawns in front of your king. That the point is this, that if h6, well, it's been found that this can be vulnerable here for a start, and also leaves the f5 square a little bit vulnerable. So you know, a knight often hops around here, and black is simply weaker on this diagonal. g6 has been tried, but then white gets a very natural attack with h5. I've lost a horrible game with black in this line. Also won a nice game with white as well. Got my revenge. But this is extremely dangerous for black. What else is there? There's king h8, which kind of puts off a decision. Of course, if bishop takes pawn, then there's g6. But eventually black is going to have to decide whether to play g6 or h6. But none of these completely satisfactory. But Liang played h5, which certainly looks very unusual. In fact, over the past couple of years, this has been played quite a lot by some pretty decent players. Looks very strange to advance the h-pawn like this, sort of away from the rest of the pawns. In fact, it's really hard for white to exploit this, and there's an immediate point that in positions like this, when, well, obviously at the moment there's a pin, but once white unpins, then it's going to be harder to bring the knight to g3 because it'll just be attacked by the pawn coming down to h4, or indeed the pawn might come to h4 and simply stop that knight getting there. So really interesting that this whole line has been revived actually by this move. Now I think the way to really test this is for white to castle queenside, to play bishop e3, castles queenside, and somehow perhaps later on try to exploit the fact that this pawn has sort of flown up the board. But of course, with kings on opposite flanks, that makes the position rather double-edged. But white played castle's kingside fairly quickly. I have to say, with black, I would feel pretty happy about that, because with this pawn advancing, it's possible to try and cramp the king on this side of the board, as we will see. So white puts a stop to anything happening with h3 with h3 himself. And we have some development on the queen side. And knight f8, or at least developing this queen's knight. I like this very much. The knight sits nicely on f8, protecting the king, but also there are possibilities to leap out at some moment to one of these squares. But for the moment it's just tucked out of the way and yeah, helping black's king as well, so that's nice. Rook d1 from white and bishop e6, so both sides developing normally. Now this is funny. Rook c8, so what's that got to do? You know, I suppose you could say it's perhaps discouraging white from pushing with d5 because the rook is on the same line as the queen, but actually there's a very blunt idea behind this. If white were to play, for example, knight c3, then I think the idea is just to tuck that bishop out of the way and then to play queen d6 or queen c7 if necessary, and play for mate down there. And it's not so stupid, and now we can see the point of putting that pawn on h4, that diagonal is now a little bit vulnerable. So you can see already that this pawn advance actually has an effect on the position. So white decided to play queen a4. Now, I suppose it's possible just to play with a6 here. But Awonder Liang decides to absolutely go for it at this point. In fact, he was obviously thinking, with that queen way across the other side of the board, then it's time to advance and go for it on the king side. And this is possible because, yeah, the queen is a long way off, but yeah, this knight is just supporting the king in case there's any trouble. I like that a lot. And this pawn starts to control this square, and there's possibility to roll on again. So this is great. And white decides, right, the classic case of how do you meet an attack on the wing? Well, you go through the centre. And there is some logic to playing d5. But with that bishop on d6, blockading, in fact, you know, the effects aren't so strong. Now, bishop takes looks really inadvisable because all those pieces lined up. I don't think we should do that. Looks very fishy to me. So bishop d7. So nicely blockaded here with the bishop. And white plunges in. Queen takes pawn. Can't see a reason why not, but it is of course very risky. And the queen steps up with the potential to come to e5. So for example, let's see what happens if white grabs another pawn. This would be exceptionally greedy. Threatening mate, obviously f4 will be met by queen takes bishop, and after g3, well, we can take straight away, but we could do this and then take on h3. Well, it's clear that black has an absolutely tremendous attack here. So maybe the best idea would be to drag that queen back to stop this, but well, in any case, white has to be fine in this position. I mean, there are some tactics here that white can play to get some exchanges in. But this would have been very, very difficult to calculate. I mean, this is a kind of computer defense. Basically, after these exchanges, an endgame is reached, which is, well, there's still a lot of play in this position actually, but it's balanced. So Queen e7 has just been played, and Black certainly has the initiative. Burke thought for 22 minutes over this next move, knight d4, in order to meet Queen e5 with knight f3, which would cover the h2 square and attack the queen. But actually Black has another way to attack, so these pawns are rolling forward. Now, you know, I mentioned earlier that this exchange on f6 and these kingside pawns can introduce some interesting dynamic ideas for Black, and this is one of them. That often you can roll these pawns down the board, and if it weren't for that pawn on f7, in fact, this wouldn't work at all, because White would have access to the e6 square, which would, you know, just completely well, put a spanner in the works. But with that pawn on f7, very useful covering pawn, actually Black can get away with this pawn storm, and this is very, very difficult now. Well, first things first, what happens if this is taken? Let's just have a quick look. We've got this, and we're back to Queen e5 again, with a double attack here and here. Okay, what happens if we play Rook e1 to cover the bishop so that there is potential to play f4 in some circumstances? Well, g4. We just keep rolling on, and that covers the f3 square. Makes it more difficult to play f4 in some positions, and well, I mean it's still not clear, this position, but certainly it's a very pleasant attack when this queen's in Kansas, and yeah, basically Black is in St. Louis. So let's go back. Rook e1 played, bishop c5, and that is a very unfortunate move to have to meet. In fact, well, I mean, White kind of capitulates now. Again, the only way to try and save this position is to calculate this move, knight f5, and which looks incredibly dodgy, but because there are queens on pre's and funny pins. But let's have a look. Queen takes bishop. Now, obviously, if knight takes, then bishop takes queen, and Black ends up a piece up. So rook takes, bishop takes, and this one isn't 100% clear. Black is definitely better here. The two minor pieces, definitely better than the rook. I think this makes a massive difference because the king is a bit cramped here. We'll see this rook is on. We have to move that back somewhere. Black is better, but it's really not clear. That was White's best chance. Instead, White played Queen a5. And now bishop takes. So basically this rook, that's the point of b6, this rook is no longer protected. So after this we can give the queen for two rooks, and the problem for White is that his king is basically in a mating net. So if here king h2, Then the next rook slams down, and once again we can see what a really important function our friend the h-pawn is performing. Harry does a good job here, just not letting the king out. So the bishop came back, but actually it doesn't really make any difference. White is just lost here. It doesn't take too much trouble to bring this bishop into the game. All we need to do is get this bishop on this diagonal and White's king is going to crumble, and that's basically what happens. And you can see this bishop wants to come here. I mean, we're going to play rook here and bishop d3, for example, but you know, there are other ways to go as well. So Burke tried to give his king some room with this pawn move, but it didn't make any difference at all. And now the bishop came in here, and the bishop is gone. And in this position, White resigned. There's nothing to do about this, and in fact, White's king is still in a mating net there. That pawn covering this pawn here. Great game, and a very, very interesting idea from Awonder Liang, this pawn move h5. He certainly wasn't the first to play this. As I said, it's quite topical, but he seemed to understand the position a lot better than his opponent. In particular, you know, this lunge on the queen side for the pawns, I thought, yeah, Liang dealt with this really well with this pawn advance. In fact, it reminds me, there's another game in this variation played a long time ago in 1978. I think it was the Olympiad in 1978, between the Philippine player Torre and Korchnoi. Korchnoi also made a pawn advance in this exact variation and won a really nice game against Torre. Maybe I'll show that in the next hangout. That'll be a good idea. Remember, if you're not a subscriber, then do click on that subscribe button, and if you want to support us, do check out the links to patreon.com and PayPal as well. Thanks for watching.